So we're going to begin now. And Bryan, thank you so much for being willing to share your knowledge and expertise with us. I don't know you. I have seen you on the screen here. So out of curiosity, I went to the Pacific Union College website to know who Bryan was so that I can kind of introduce him to you. He has been teaching there for over 30 years in the biology department, and I was interested in some of the courses he teaches: scientific discoveries, genetics, issues on origins, biotechnology, some fascinating topics that he teaches. Bryan has a bachelor's in science and a master's in science in biology from Walla Walla University, and a PhD in botany from the Washington State University. But I think what ought to cause us to give him a lot of attention today is what is listed on that page in answer to a question: do you have any pets? And here's how Bryan has answered that question. And after you hear what I've say, you will know why you need to pay a lot of attention to him. He says he has 2 cats, 2 rats, a guinea pig, about 15 snakes, 3 turtles, 4 lizards, and about 25 tarantulas, and a partridge on a pear tree. So he's evidently seen on campus with snakes wrapped around him. I don't see any snakes now, but Bryan, you must be a very interesting person. I'm sure your students love your classes. So thank you for being here, and we are all ears. So what do you have to offer us?
Well, thank you. And I always, it always amuses me when I hear people say I graduated from Walla Walla University, because in my day it was Walla Walla College. And for some reason, all these places become universities. So I kind of like that. And as far as the pets, that list is old. It's shifted a bit, but it's still about more or less accurate. So yeah, I'd love to get some of you to know some of my tarantulas, but that often is something that people find a little daunting. So, well, anyway, I'm going to go ahead and bring my presentation up here, and I'm going to just my title. I actually titled a little different than Lauren had online. And because I think one of the things I like to do, and I teach, as you mentioned, I teach a class called Issues and Origins, and I like to be very respectful of everybody's views, because I have students who come in with who are atheists, not many, but I get some, and I get many who are very conservative in their views on creation and evolution and Noah's flood. And so I like to use a title like this that's a little more neutral. What about Noah's flood? And what can we do with it? And this is one of the issues that we study quite a bit in Issues on Origins, although we spend a lot more time on evolution itself. And just so you know, my training, that degree in botany is actually, to be specific, I'm actually a molecular plant systematist. That was my training. So basically plant evolution was what I was trained in. So at any rate, before I get into the topic though in detail, I want to just take a moment and actually read at least a portion of the story out of Genesis, because it's just, whoops, I went up one page accidentally there. So I'm just going to read the basic part of the story, not all of it, just to give us the context, so we're all together, at least having heard a portion of the story. And it starts here. Now God saw that the earth had become corrupt and was filled with violence. God observed all this corruption in the world, for everyone on earth was corrupt. So God said to Noah, I have decided to destroy all living creatures, for they have filled the earth with violence. Yes, I will wipe them all out along with the earth. Build a large boat from cypress wood and waterproof it with tar inside and out. Then construct decks and stalls throughout its interior. Make the boat 450 feet long, 700 or excuse me, 75 feet wide and 45 feet high. Leave an 18-inch opening below the roof all the way around the boat. Put the door on the side and build 3 decks inside the boat, lower, middle, and upper. Look, I'm about to cover the earth with a flood that will destroy every living thing that breathes. Everything on earth will die, but I will confirm my covenant with you. So enter the boat, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring a pair of every kind of animal, a male and female, into the boat with you to keep them alive during the flood. Pairs of every kind of bird and every kind of animal and every kind of small animal that scurries along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. And be sure to take on board enough food for your family and for all the animals. So Noah did everything exactly as God had commanded him. Now, I chose the New Living Translation just because it's nice to give a little bit of a modern feel to the story. So that's why it may sound a little less familiar. But when I was growing up, and many of you may remember this, the Bible in Living Sound. Any of you remember that one? I'm sure you do. And I still remember as a child listening to that on LP back in the day. And there are parts of the story on the Bible in Living Sound that aren't here in the Bible. And one that always has struck me was the idea that Noah preached for 120 years, to bring people on to try and save as many as possible. But if you actually read the Genesis account, God did not say he was going to save anybody but Noah's family. There's not a mention of anybody else at all, or any chance of mercy for anybody else. Now, it's interesting. I've always wondered, where did that come from? And I looked it up a few weeks ago just so I could figure out, where did that idea that Noah preached 120 years come from? And it turns out it has a long tradition. It's sort of started around, they think, in the 1st or 2nd century, that the people started talking about Noah having done that, having preached, because there's some New Testament mention kind of Noah maybe preaching or being a preacher. And so it has become kind of part of the story by the time we get to our day. And that's why the Bible Living Sound, I think, included it. But it's not there in the Bible at all. That's not a part of the story. So part of what we want to do today, I think, is to be careful we read the story exactly as it is in Genesis, because people do say, well, we need to read it as it is. So let's try at least as best we can do that. And I want to make one more point in that regard, because the Bible, the Living Bible in this case, mentions what the boat was made from. And it says cypress wood, which is interesting because if you actually go to the original Hebrew, the word used there is, nobody knows what it means. In the old King James, it was gopher wood, by the way. And we don't know what that word in the Hebrew means. And I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so I'm not going to try and say the word. But the word in Hebrew is of uncertain origin, and it may even mean reed. We just don't know. We have no idea. And so some have speculated that Noah's Ark would have been a reed boat, not a boat made of wood. So at any rate, that's just a little background. And I want to kind of start our discussion today with some questions. And then I'm going to gradually begin to answer these questions in a fashion. And we'll leave some of these questions even until the end when we can talk about them together. And some of these are like, for example, what is the purpose of the story in context? So I want to talk about that. What is Noah's, the flood story? What is it about in context, in its story, right there in Genesis? And then what do modern Christians see as the purpose of the story? So what is the story for us today? And I think as we talk today, I think we'll notice that we have actually added some things to it that were not maybe the original purposes of the story. And so we need to think about that. Is that appropriate? Is the story's intention to teach history or science, or is it a figurative story? And there's a bit of tension there. That's a long-standing tension. There's a lot of people that have looked at this story both ways. So I think we need to talk about that. Does evidence from science support a literal reading of the story? So if I take scientific data, can I really support the story of Noah's flood as it's described in the book of Genesis? So yeah, and we'll spend a lot of time on that, by the way. And then if it is decided that the story is figurative, which a lot of people have, of course, how does it affect theology? Especially, how does it affect theology within our church? Because that's a big issue for many Adventists. So with that in mind, I want to start about the purposes first. And I think, this is going to be brief, of course, because this is one Sabbath school, and this is a topic that we could spend, weeks on, and there are literal books written about it. So, but in brief, in its ancient context, okay, it's clearly part of Israel's origin story. Where did Israel come from? You know, who are the ancestors of this nation? And Noah is in that line. So that's part of their ancestral origin story. But even bigger than that, it contrasts Israel's God with that of the other ancient Near Eastern flood narratives, because we have other narratives, and many of you know of these, but there are other flood stories from the Near East. And the flood story in Genesis stands out above all the others because in the Genesis story, there's a single God. God is one. There is no other. There are no other gods. And God, as a single God, is the player in this story, as opposed to the Near Eastern stories, which typically involve multiple gods. Well, in fact, all of them do involve multiple gods. And in fact, the story in the Near Eastern versions involves really the gods not even liking humans, not even wanting them, and that's why they're going to destroy them. So it's a very different kind of story. It teaches us about God's judgment against sin, and that he is also merciful, because notice he chooses from the beginning to save Noah and his family. And this also contrasts with the other Near Eastern flood stories, where the gods in those stories do not do that. So that's, you know, in context, those are the main messages of the story of the flood. And I think it does that well. And, you know, a lot of Hebrew scholars appreciate the story because of this very clear indication of a single God who has judgment in mind, but he is also merciful. Now, we have added things to that, though. So if we go along through time and come to our modern day, and Adventists especially, but we're not the only ones, we have added two other purposes to this story. One is an apocalyptic lesson. And we all know that the text in Peter where he talks about the days, you know, in the end days will be like the days of Noah. And that will be what it's like just before the Lord returns. It's going to be, you know, everybody's going to be committing sins, and it's going to be just terrible, just like it was before the flood. Some have even gone so far as to say that those that are scoffing at the end times are those who do not accept the flood as a literal story. So it's even been co-opted in that sense, so that the flood story becomes a test of faith for those that are in the last days getting ready for Christ's return. So there's one of the purposes, and that's been a very Adventist one, but again, some other millennialist type churches and stuff that came out of the 1844 movement have also taken on that approach, as well as some fundamentalist churches. Then secondly, it provides an explanation for the fossil record, because the fossil record's long been a problem. How do you explain the fossil record? Because it gives every indication of being a very old sequence of organisms that have died over millions, many millions of years. So how do you explain that, that it looks so old, but it actually only happened recently? Well, if you have a worldwide flood that covers the entire earth and buries everything, all of those animals, there you go, you've solved the problem. So that's the second purpose of the flood story. And this has become especially prominent in the 20th century among Adventists and other fundamentalists because of that reason. So now, let's then think about this. Is Noah's flood actually history? So I'm going to go right to the jugular, as you might say. And one of the things I want to say today is that when I teach this in my class on origins, I talk to my students, I tell them I'm going to be very upfront here about what evidence I know to be true and what I don't know about things. So what does science have to say? I have to be very upfront about that. And I always tell my students, I say, I'm not going to lie for Jesus. Okay. I mean, if I'm trying to defend a particular viewpoint, I'm not going to fudge on the facts. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm just going to be very open about this. So first of all, is there physical evidence for a worldwide flood? Well, I'm going to make that a simple answer and just say no. We could spend a long time looking at a variety of things. I'm not a geologist. I've studied a lot of geology, and I have a lot of geologist friends, and they assure me that there is no evidence for a worldwide flood, not anywhere. Okay, so there's that. Is there evidence for the existence of the person Noah? Well, in terms of archaeology, no. I think, though, given the Old Testament and the way it's written and the history behind it among the Jews and among Israel, I think, yeah, there's a good chance he was a real historical person. I don't think there's any reason for us to doubt that he existed. Who exactly was he? We don't know, and we have no physical evidence of his of him ever existing. But, it seems like there must have been somebody that corresponds with Noah. So I'm not going to even talk about that one anymore. I'm just going to assume that, yeah, it's a pretty good to consider him a historical person. Now, is there any evidence for a kind of catastrophic flood in the correct time frame for where Genesis places the flood historically? Okay, now when I say here catastrophic flood, I don't mean necessarily worldwide. I mean any catastrophic flood that might have happened in that region. Now, this one gets a little flaky, and we'll spend a little more time later on this, but the quick answer is not really. Nothing that corresponds exactly to the time frame happened in that region. There's one that I'll talk about a little later that some people have used for that purpose, but it doesn't seem to fit very well. So that one's a little bit of a harder question, and it would take a lot more time. And then lastly, are the details of the story scientifically plausible? So let alone the evidence. Okay, let's not even worry about evidence. Are the descriptive elements of the story, are they themselves plausible? So that's another aspect. So I'm going to now begin looking at some of these aspects, and to lay the groundwork, the background for that, I want to make sure that you're clear on what somebody who lived during that time, how would they have viewed the universe? What was their cosmology? And I'm indebted to this nice diagram. I found this years ago, and it is a very nicely put together diagram that describes exactly how Genesis describes the cosmos. And if you start reading Genesis, first 11 chapters, this is the picture you get. Here it is. The earth is probably flat. All the evidence seems to suggest that ancient Israelites believed the earth was flat. And earth itself, the solid part of the earth that we live on, represented some ground that was on pillars. And these pillars extend down into the great deep. So this land that we live on, the earth, is floating in a sense on this great deep of water. The pillar is kind of supporting it in some sense, and it's not clear what they sit on, but there's water underneath. And then there's air above us, and so this would be the sky and so on that you see, and the sun and the moon are up there, and the stars are there. And then separating the sky from the rest of the cosmos is this big dome. And you can see there in this picture, the dark blue color there, that's the dome. It was considered to be a solid sort of object of some sort that separates the waters above from the waters beneath. And so that's how it's described in Genesis chapter 1 during the creation story. And so as you can see, everything that's visible in the night sky is actually a part of what they would consider the earth. And then above that is this water that is held at bay by this large dome. Now, this makes the flood story actually very, very easy to explain in context, because the way it's described in Genesis, it talks about the heavens, the windows of heaven opening. Well, yeah, that's where a lot of the water had to come from. So you see that large amounts of water, and because the firmament, the waters above the firmament are essentially kind of viewed as being really massive, you have a lot of water available. Plus, you have all the water of the great deep, and that also is described in Genesis, that water breaks up from the ground, and inundates the earth. And so the availability of water is very clear in this view of the cosmos. So if we look at the story in that context, it's a very good story. It really tells it nicely in the context of their view of the cosmology. What we need to ask ourselves is, does this story work with our current understanding of cosmology? Because we no longer recognize a dome above the heavens, and we know the stars and the sun and all that are actually way apart, further away from us than is implied by the cosmology of ancient Israel. So, but we need to keep in mind, this is the context the story is told in. This is what that story, it makes sense to somebody in ancient Israel because they understood the universe to be this way. Now, back to the basic facts of the story before we look at some of the details again. I want to make sure we're all clear on these. So kind of extracting out of here, Noah built a wooden boat. That's the traditional view of this. Again, we don't know if it was wooden or not based on the Hebrew. And it's the largest boat ever documented, largest wooden boat ever documented. And there are the dimensions. And this is based, by the way, on the cubit being 18 inches. We don't know for sure what their measurements were, but that's the conservative estimate for what it is. In addition to the humans, Noah took 14 of each bird and clean animal and 2 of each unclean animal into the ark. So a lot of animals. 40 days of rain resulted in the flood covering the highest mountains, according to Genesis count. It lasted 150 days, and then the water evaporated enough after those 150 days, finally, that the ark rested on Mount Ararat. And then at some later point, the ark was opened. And the traditional date of the flood is given as 2348 BCE. There's lots of, been recalculations of people on this and extensions of the time frame a little bit. But 2348 to nowadays, some people might say, oh, maybe 4500 BC, might be the latest possible date. But, it goes all over the place. But this is the traditional one, based on Ussher's chronology, is 2348 BCE. And I'm going to just go with that one for now, just because that's the traditional date. So there's your facts. And now I want to just quickly, in broad brushstrokes, give what modern flood geology says about the story. So here's the response from modern flood geologists to the Genesis account of the flood. And I'm not going to comment yet on how accurate any of these are very much. We'll look at the details later, but this is the story, and this is the typical story that you'll see shared often in churches and from geologists and flood, should say, scientific creationists and so on. Noah only included the basic kinds of animals in the ark. So that's one of the things, because obviously we have, with the number of species we have on the earth today, there would have been no way for Noah to take all the species. So he took the kinds. And that word kind is a kind of a slippery word. It's like, okay, maybe he took one example of each family of animal, or maybe each phylum. And so people have argued about how many that would be, how many animals actually that would be on the ark, but that's how the story is given. Now, the water for the flood, where did it come from? Because we obviously don't have enough water today to have inundated the earth as described in Genesis. So where did it come from? Well, one source was underground. And the other source would have been from the air. But again, the air doesn't have enough. But remember that dome and the water above that dome. Okay, well, a lot of flood geologists have taken that to mean there was a vapor barrier above the earth. They don't believe in the solid dome, of course, but a vapor layer. And then, because even that wouldn't probably give it quite enough water, a number of flood geologists have suggested that there was a swarm of meteorites, or not meteorites, comets, excuse me, that collided above the earth at that time and provided more water. So there you go, there's the water. The topography of the earth was also flatter at that time, so you didn't actually need as much water as we would surmise today, because the mountains weren't as high. So you don't need quite as much water. It's still a lot of water, I have to say, but a lot less. And so it was able to cover all the mountains of that day because they were much lower. And then, of course, the flood itself produced some of the higher mountains as a result. Then at that time, too, the Earth's continents were likely together, or at least there were good land bridges that went from continent to continent, which enabled the animals after they left the ark to actually migrate to all of the various continents. And because Noah would have only taken the various basic kinds of animals in order to repopulate the earth and to bring it back to its normal levels of diversity, there would have had to have been some sort of hyperspeciation process that would create that diversity we see today. So there would have been, some have suggested that the genetic systems of organisms at that time were much more fluid, and there was much more variability. And so they could evolve very, very rapidly over just hundreds of years instead of over the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years that typically evolution says is required. And the earth then gets repopulated as we see it today. And then lastly, the fossils are the result of all life not on the ark being buried by the flood, by those sediments that were being distributed by the flood. And sometimes the ecological zonation theory has been invoked as a way to explain the orderliness of that fossil record, because most of you may know that the fossil record is extremely orderly. We don't ever find human fossils in the same layers as dinosaurs, for example. I mean, dinosaurs are always down in the Jurassic and lower, and they, they're not up in our current upper layers where you find more mammals and so on. So, the layering is very orderly. And so in order to explain that, this ecological zonation theory has been proposed. And I'll talk about that briefly later, what that theory is. So this is the story. This is the proof from science that is often given by creation scientists that the flood was a literal worldwide event. Okay, well, let's now start looking at some of the pieces. And I'm going to start with some of the other pieces, not the scientific parts of this story that I just gave, but just some of the plausibility parts. And so one of those is the size of the ark. And this is not a new problem. The ark at 450 feet long and 75 feet wide would represent the largest wooden boat ever constructed. And I'm saying ever. In fact, clearly the largest wooden only boat ever constructed. Now, the largest wooden ship that has ever been constructed since then has been the sailing ship Wyoming. And it was a really famous ship because it was pretty large. And it turns out it was 450 feet long. So same length as the ark. But look here at what its problems were. The Wyoming tended to flex in heavy seas, causing the planks to twist and buckle, which meant it took on a lot of water all the time, which required constant pumping with steam pumps. So it wasn't really seaworthy. It sailed for a few years, but it finally foundered in heavy seas with loss of all hands because of its instability. And keep in mind, too, that the Wyoming had some metal bracing. So it wasn't just wooden. So I'm kind of cheating a little bit to say that that it's the largest wooden boat ever constructed. It's mostly wood. But so Noah's flood would clearly be the largest by far of any fully wooden boat ever constructed. So this means that the ark's a little bit, it kind of strains credulity in terms of its size. Now that people have gone through the engineering of it and said, yes, the ark could float. That's certainly possible, but to say that it's seaworthy, most marine geologists, or geologists, not geologists, engineers, excuse me, say no, it would not be seaworthy. So there's that problem. Now the water. Where did all that water come from? Well, if you do a few calculations, if you assume today's topography, which again, a lot of flood geologists don't, but if we did, and I think it seems reasonable to expect the same topography today as then, but anyway, if we did, it would take heavy rainfall, which, and I may have to revise this calculation these days because we've had some pretty heavy rainfall on the East Coast just recently, but I don't think it exceeded 1.97 inches per hour. So that's the heaviest ever recorded, by the way, on Earth. If we had rainfall of that rate, it would take 20.2 years to cover Mount Everest. So not only do we have a water volume issue, we have a water time issue. How do you fill that space that quickly? Well, it's possible, of course, that, things were lower. So I can give that to the flood geology argument. Now, to deposit that much water in 40 days, it would take a rate of 30.18 feet per hour, or we could maybe back off a bit, assuming mountains weren't quite as high, maybe 100 feet a day. Okay, so 100 feet of water a day for 40 days. That might actually cover the entire Earth. The calculations here are pretty rough because it's hard to know exactly what what the sizes really are altogether. Now, the other problem, of course, is not just how do you build this amount of water up, but how do you get rid of it? Because the water had to recede. Now, if you were going to evaporate the water from, let's say, above Mount Everest to the level of Mount Ararat, that would take 63,000 years to evaporate. So not only where did it go, but could you even do it in that amount of time? Wow, 63,000 years. That's problematic. Let's ignore that though, because again, the high mountains, maybe they weren't as high back then. So we'll give it that. But let's just say from Mount Ararat to the current sea level, it would take 10,000 years for the water to evaporate from Mount Ararat to our current sea level. So at least according to science, the way the story is told, that over a 150-day period, the water evaporated enough for Noah to land the ark on Mount Ararat, and that today, of course, we have water at the ocean level. And that doesn't seem possible because we haven't had 10,000 years between then and now. Plus, a lot of people lived in the Middle East during that period, so clearly the water had evaporated already. So there's some problems with the water issues. Now, scale and timing of the flood. As I already mentioned in the earlier part of this presentation, there's no evidence of a completely worldwide flood of the proportions described at any time in geologic history. Just isn't there. So that we don't have. There is evidence of extremely catastrophic floods in various parts of the world, no doubt about it. Even though geologists for a long time were not too willing to look at that, nowadays it's pretty much okay to recognize these catastrophic floods. And they've happened all over the place at different time frames, at different locations. And one of my favorites, some of you may have already heard of this one, is the Missoula floods, or sometimes called Brett's flood, because the scientist who first published about this, his last name was Brett. And this set of floods happened, according to geologists, and this is mainline geology, occurred between 15,000 and 13,000 years ago during the post-glacial, or kind of the end of the glacial period, as waters were melting from the large Cordilleran ice sheet, as you can see there on the left-hand picture. And water built up into large pools, one of those being Lake Missoula. And it had a ice barrier that prevented the water from flowing out. That's how the lake built up. And then every so often, these ice barriers would break. And a series of repeated catastrophic flooding events occurred in eastern Washington. And the reason kind of my favorites is I drove through there many times on the way to Walla Walla College in that day. And I could see the scablands of eastern Washington. And I love this picture down here on the right. This is actually a picture of a canyon near the town. And those of you that have been to Walla Walla, remember that little town near on the way to the Columbia River from Walla Walla called, well, it's spelled like Touche, but they pronounce it Tushy. I always loved that, Tushy. Anyway, this canyon is there nearby, and you can see it's pretty obvious these large, these thick layers of sediment build up, and this is quite visible. And people have analyzed these layers, and they found at some of the layers, a few of the layers have volcanic debris from the eruption of Mount St. Helens that occurred sometime during that period, and it spread through some of the layers. And there's also rodent burrows at certain levels where the rodents obviously got inundated at that time period when that flood occurred, and so on. So this gives every indication of having happened over a few thousand-year period, or several thousand years period, back during the melting of the previous glaciers. So this is very consistent with the geology that is told about the area, but it is a catastrophic flood. And so it is really consistent in some ways with a worldwide flood, but it's only regional. And the other problem with it, though, is these layers don't seem to have been able to be laid down in 1 year, which the worldwide flood would require. So because of things like those volcanic layers and the rodent burrows, that really makes it difficult to explain this as all happening in one short time period. So even though it seems to provide some really neat evidence for a catastrophic flood, which it was, it's actually a series of catastrophic floods, apparently, not a single one. And it's isolated to eastern Washington. If there had been a worldwide flood, we'd expect this kind of evidence to be found all over the earth, wherever you go. And we don't really see that. So anyway, but that is a cool thing. And I think it's neat that geologists have finally been able to recognize that, yes, catastrophic flooding does occur sometimes. And there it was. Now, some people who have decided that Noah's flood really isn't worldwide would like to, or would love to find evidence of a really large regional flood in the Near East region that could be the source of the Noah story and of the other Near Eastern flood stories. And there is evidence of some catastrophic flooding in the region. One of the more famous ones, I'll show you in just a moment here. But the problem is that none of them match up even close to the Usher flood date of 2348 BCE. And so that's why that date has been pushed back by some flood geologists, because there are some floods in that region that may correspond to Noah's flood if you push the date back further. And it's not clear how far for sure you'd have to put it back, because there's even some debate about flood, the main flood that I'm going to show you in a moment. And that last question I'll get to as well, but here's this flood here. This one, some years ago, and I've forgotten the date now when Noah's flood came out, but this the book called Noah's Flood by Ryan and Pittman, fascinating book. They had a theory that a large flood occurred in the Black Sea region, which would also encompass areas of the Middle East. It would have had effects there, and may have been the source of the Noah's flood stories. And their arguments are based on a variety of geological measurements they'd done in the Black Sea region. They had a pretty good argument, I thought, but a lot of geologists have questioned some of their results, and there's been some debate about the exact timing of this flood. The most favored time period is around 5,600 BC, a little before 5,600 BC. And the human migration patterns of that era seem to suggest that a large flood like that displaced a lot of people, and that's why that date is one of the ones chosen. So this is a possible, one that could have been Noah's flood, but note the date, 5,600 BC, is a little far back if you're going to go with a 6,000-year age of the Earth. So that is troubling. Of course, as some of you also know, that we have had some flexibility among flood geologists and creationists of pushing time back maybe 10,000 years or something for the creation. So that would push this back. But at any rate, this is an ongoing sort of discovery problem for people, that they want to find, is there really any story of a large flood in the region that could have been the source of the Noah story if it wasn't worldwide? So there's one example. Now, the fossil record, and this is the biggest issue of all. And it also is the most important of the issues, because remember that if we're going to explain the fossil record, the flood would be a perfect way to do it. Okay, so if you lose the flood, if you lose a worldwide flood, you have lost your best argument for explaining the fossil record. Thus, the reason for a great reluctance to give up on the flood story. Okay, so we really need it. And so one of those, and I kind of think this is kind of neat for me historically. I teach in Clark Hall here on the PUC campus. Harold Clark, who also used to teach at PUC, developed what he called the ecological zonation theory. And he suggested that the floodwaters, as they rose, inundated various ecological zones that correspond to the fossil layers that geologists have identified with the organisms that are there. And so those organisms were buried in situ, successively as the waters rose. Now, the only problem with his theory, though, is if you start scrutinizing it in detail, it has lots and lots of flaws. There's simply, in each of those ecological zones, there's some organisms that are there at the correct layers, but there are some that aren't. And, because not everything quite falls out the same because in other words, there's sea organisms that are found in layers that doesn't make sense, because they should have all been buried already. So anyway, there's lots and lots of issues there. And so a lot of people have studied the ecological zonation theory for many years. A lot of creationist geologists have studied it for years, trying to continue to shoehorn in the data into this model. So it's still a favored model, and it certainly, I think, has some merit to look at, but it has so many problems that a lot of mainline geologists and paleontologists just don't accept it. And of course, some flood geologists have also suggested the fossil record's not organized. It's hard to get too far in that argument, because it really is quite organized. It's consistent worldwide. You can go to the same layers in other parts of the world, and you find the same successions of organisms. So it's really difficult to argue that it's not organized. But some have tried that and even said that it's upside down and so on. And then another point that is often made by paleontologists: if you go to some fossil beds that are extremely rich, that have just piles and piles of organisms, layer upon layer upon layer, and it just goes on and on and on. If all of those organisms had been alive at one time, there would have been so many organisms there, they would have been shoulder to shoulder, and it would have been impossible ecologically. So that's also another objection that's a little hard to deal with, because there really are a lot of fossils in some fossil beds, in layer after layer after layer. And how in the world could all of them have been there at one time? And then, of course, the big question, dinosaurs. Well, okay, wait for it. Here's my answer to that. I don't know, but I like the cartoon because we're in COVID, and this would really, yeah, there's nothing I can do. If I let you on, there's no way to keep everybody 6 feet apart. Okay, so yeah, there wasn't any room in the ark apparently, so Noah didn't take them on. We don't know. I mean, but the dinosaurs just don't fit into any of these stories, really. And there's no evidence that humans and dinosaurs lived together at the same time. There have been attempts by creationists in the past to look at some fossil beds where there were apparent human footprints, but even the best of the creationists had to finally say, no, those don't represent human footprints that were next to dinosaur footprints and so on. So all of that has kind of fallen apart. And so dinosaurs, yeah, we don't know. I don't know. Nobody knows what to do with them. So I'm just going to leave them and let you have Frank and Ernest explain that problem there. Now, plate tectonics. Okay, this is a really important piece for the modern retelling from flood geologists of how we get the Earth repopulated. Because plate tectonics, there it is. There's the answer. The movement of the continents from Pangea could explain how the Earth got repopulated from a single point where Noah's Ark had rested. Okay, well, yeah, except let's do a little calculating here, just to see how plausible this is. Right now, we know that there's a portion of South America that was touching a portion of Africa that now are 3,146 miles apart from each other. So just doing some rough calculations, if we were to assume that over the last, let's just give it 4,500 years. So in other words, they didn't reach this 3,146 mile distance until today. They would have had to move at 0.72 miles per year, which represents about 10.4 feet per day. The plate that the South American continent is on and Africa's on would have had to move apart from each other at about 10.4 feet per day since they were together at the time of Pangea. Now, currently, we can measure plate movements. We've done this for many years now. The current fastest plate movements are typically around 4 inches per year. That's the typical rate of movement. Now, we, of course, have some faster plate movements every so often, and some of you may have been around for the Loma Prieta earthquake back in 1989. I was sitting in my office in Clark Hall when it happened, and I thought there were a bunch of people going up and down our fire escape when it started shaking. I'm from Western Washington, by the way, and so I hadn't experienced quite as many earthquakes as some Californians have. So I just thought, well, that's weird. Why are those people running up and down? And then all of a sudden I felt the building moving and realized, oh yeah, this is an earthquake. Well, that earthquake, which was pretty significant, 6.9, moved the Pacific plate relative to the North American plate by 6.2 feet. Okay, so in other words, if we're saying that these continents were moving apart since Pangea to the present day at 10.4 feet per day, we're having a Loma Prieta, actually a bigger than Loma Prieta quake every day for however long. Well, and that's not even the worst problem. It's really the heat that builds up because you've got friction when continents are moving. And if you're moving at 10.4 feet per day, you're going to produce so much friction that, and again, I'm not a geologist, but that's a lot of heat. And I'm told by geologists that would liquefy the continents to the point where life couldn't exist on them. So it's a really tough one to actually suggest that the continents were together at the end of the flood and aren't today. And their flood geologists would like that to be true and suggest maybe it is, and we're just working on a way to make that work. Okay, more power to you, but it's a tough one. So it's going to be hard to shoehorn that one in. Okay, biogeography, which is a related problem. Except for the plate tectonic story I just told, there really is no good explanation as to why almost all of many types of animals are confined to a single geographic region. Australia, I have Australian friends who have marsupials. There are a few marsupials in other parts of the world, but the bulk of the marsupials are in Australia. Why? And why not in other places? Hummingbirds, all new world. No hummingbirds in the old world. Why? And the list goes on. And I'm a botanist, and I could point out, hundreds of plant genera and families even that follow similar patterns. So what is this? How could we get the world divided up in such a fashion without evolution maybe explaining it? And by the way, flood geologists actually do use evolution in that way. So notice, most young Earth creationists reject macroevolution. So they reject it, yet they invoke hyper rates of macroevolution to repopulate the Earth after the flood. I'm not sure what to say about that because I spent many years, talking to my students about the arguments against evolutionary biology, and now I'm having to tell them, I guess, based on this approach, that it actually works, but only in certain circumstances, such as after the flood. So it gets very confusing. And the other problem with that, with the idea that this extreme hyper rates of macroevolution occurred, and of course they wouldn't call it macroevolution necessarily, so I'm using my terms more strictly according to evolutionary biology, but at any rate, there's a big problem of genetic bottleneck. If you have, let's say, two individuals on the ark of a specific type or kind, they have very little of the genetic variation that existed in that entire species. And we know, most of you who had any biology know that genetic bottlenecks are really bad. One of the concerns we have about endangered species is when a species gets down to only a few individuals, maybe 10, 20, 30 individuals, that's just, extinction's just around the corner because they have no genetic resiliency left. And so how do you go through this process of producing greater biodiversity when all you have are these small relic populations of anything from 2 to 14 individuals that represent not just their own species, but all of the different kinds that are going to have to evolve from them in a mere few thousand years. So, and then we have to kind of also recognize that based on early accounts of explorers in antiquity and archaeological evidence, organismal diversity has not changed all that much in the last 2,500 years. It's actually gone down. That's what it's done, is all the evidence, because humans are good at killing things. but it hasn't changed that much in the last 2,500 years as far as we can tell. And so if we say, okay, well, let's give the last 2,500 years, well, maybe it all happened just 2,000 years then. So you can see there's some real big problems with biogeography. It's very difficult to figure out how do we repopulate the Earth, using the general biological principles we understand. Okay, then there's archaeology, and I'm not an archaeologist, so I'm just going to flash this through one really quick one. Most of you probably have some interest in archaeology. Adventists often do, and Egyptian archaeology is really fun. We have evidence of Egyptian civilization going back to at least around 8,000 years ago, and of course more primitive civilization before that. That well predates the flood. There's good artifacts that predate the flood, the date for the flood. So I don't know what to do with that. And there's other cultures around the world that predate the flood as well. Of course, these dates, the 8,000 year and other ones, rely quite a bit on carbon dating, but other independent methods also confirm many of these dates. And some people say, well, carbon dating doesn't work. Well, okay, if it didn't work, these would be wrong, I guess. But what if it does work? So it's a problem. Archaeology suggests that humans have been around quite a bit before the flood and left artifacts that would have been destroyed during the flood. And anyway, I'll leave that for others to worry about. Okay, then there's chronology, and that is, in other words, determining time. And we have a variety of measuring tools available to us. One is a tree called Methuselah, which is still living up in the mountains here in California. And it has been dated using dendrochronological methods to be 4,765 years old, which predates the Usher flood date by a few hundred years. And it would be hard to imagine that a tree like that could survive a worldwide flood. I've heard people suggest that maybe it did, but that doesn't seem likely. And then we can look at other dating methods. You can look at coral reefs, and we have documented many coral reefs that are between 5,000 and 10,000 years old. Based on what we know about coral growth, you can go through the layers. It's sort of like dating layers on a tree, and that's how old they are. So those would have also predated the flood and in situ, continuing to grow throughout the entire process. There's also unbroken tree ring records. If you go back to the Methuselah tree and its cohorts, there obviously are trees that died in the past, and you can line up the rings in the trees with the dead ones, and then you can extend your time backwards. And they've done that now to about 13,000 years in the past, about 13,000 BC, yeah, BCE, excuse me. So I might have put that, shouldn't be BCE, it should be before present. I'm using my numbers or my letters wrong there. But anyway, 13,000 years ago. And carbon dating of the rings of some of those trees also correspond very closely to those same dates. So carbon dating and tree ring data correlate very closely with each other. Then we can go to the ice cores, go up to Greenland, go to Antarctic, and drill for ice cores. And this is all data that's accrued in the last, most of the last 50 years, and some of it even less. In fact, the really old dates more recently. But we have unbroken ice core records going back to at least 800,000 years before the present. There's no place in that series of layers where a flood event seems to have happened, because a flood would have made some mark in ice core records, but we don't see anything there. Lake sediment records, up to about 1.4 million years. These are, in other words, these are varves, individual layers of sediment that have been dated, going back with an unbroken line 1.4 million years back in time. And I have a friend who's actually a palynologist who tells me, oh yes, I mean, in fact, you can tell the ecology throughout many of those years. You can just take a layer, look at the pollen, and you can tell what was living at that time in terms of the plants that were there. And then inferring from the plants, you can figure out the animals. And if you get fossil beds that date to the same time period, you can often line those up as well. So there doesn't seem to be any break in that. It just goes back and back and back, 1.4 million years. Okay, so there's an overview. And I mean, I could go on a lot more probably, but I think I've given enough material, I think, for us to at least think about these issues. And how do we respond to that? Now, we've had a variety of historical responses. The Adventist Church and many fundamentalists usually take this first response, and that is keep reevaluating the scientific evidence until it agrees with the preferred literal interpretation of the Noachian flood. So that's one approach. And one way of doing that is to simply say, okay, we don't have the scientific data right now to support a worldwide flood, but we're going to keep working on it. And I'm going to put the question on the shelf and just leave it for now, because I expect eventually we're going to have the evidence to support. So that's a typical approach, and I did that. I did that many a time over the years myself. That's a great approach. Go ahead and just put it on hold, and we'll keep looking at the evidence. Or we could, number two, recognize that science does not support a literal interpretation, but that it is still correct and can be accounted for by miraculous interventions by God. Now, that's a second possibility, and I think that one has some merit, because here's the deal. If objective evidence doesn't agree, how can you simply say the objective evidence isn't true? It could be that God actually did do miracles to make the flood happen as described in Genesis, and that the evidence we're observing is the way it is because of the way that God did those miracles. So he might have actually constructed the fossil record, for example. Now, it's hard for me to understand why God would construct a fossil record to make it look like it's old, but we couldn't rule that out. So people could choose to say, well, I'm just by faith, I'm going to accept the biblical record. It was a worldwide flood, and God simply did all this stuff. God made sure the ark stayed afloat. God made sure all the animals were fed. God maybe helped repopulate the earth by some unknown methods, and the list can go on. He got rid of the water. God could do any of those things. So we could retreat into that approach, at least recognizing, though, that we don't have science to support this. So we're not going to keep trying to use science, but we're going to at least say, okay, God did it by miracle. Okay, so that's a possible way too. And I know those who've done that as well, that have taken that approach. Number three, we could reinterpret the Genesis account of the flood as a localized event that the writers of Genesis believed was worldwide. They may have believed that. And so they wrote it that way. Today we can look at it and say, well, no, it wasn't worldwide, but they thought it was. So of course the story says it's worldwide, because that's what they thought it was. And that's how they wrote it. Now, a slightly different approach would be number four, reinterpret the Genesis account as a localized event, same thing there, that has been mythologized and is intended to be interpreted figuratively. In other words, it's based on a story that did happen, but it's been heavily mythologized to make it a better story. There's been, more hyperbole introduced and so on, making it a universal flood, to make it that God is the God of the universe, and thus the story has greater meaning for that reason. So number 4 means that the writers, the tellers of the story, they recognize it probably wasn't worldwide, but it needed that in the story, and that's okay. That's a good story. Or the last one is consider the Genesis account as simply a story intended to be taken figuratively. So the writers knew that. They just told the story because it's a good story. It's a way to show God's justice, God's mercy. They knew that about God. They just wanted a vehicle to teach it. And there it is. Now, of course, as we look at these options, we have to then ask, what are the consequences of each of these? And, number 1, well, the consequences, we may look like, we may look foolish to much of the world if we take number 1. Number 2 might make us look a little foolish too. So those are ones that might make us look a little, people aren't as ready to accept those. The others might mess up our theology. So what do they do? How do we approach that? Well, I then want to go back to the purposes of the story. But that first slide one of the early slides I had, does making the story figurative ruin any of these purposes? Well, I would argue that the first purposes there, the ancient contextual purposes there, are not ruined at all. They mean the same thing. There's no difference. The figurative story teaches those very same truths anyway. So we don't need to maintain a worldwide flood to teach the first main purposes that Israel had for their flood story. Granted, the modern versions of our purposes, the modern purposes we have for the story, those could be at risk. The apocalyptic lesson, well, not so much, because we could still argue that, yes, before the flood, as described in the story, people were very wicked. Before Christ's return, yep, people are very wicked. So that, we don't necessarily lose that by a figurative telling, but we certainly lose the last one, the fossil record. And that's catastrophic to some people. So yes, that's a difficult one. What do you do if you don't have this nice, neat worldwide flood to solve the fossil record issue? What do you do with that? So where do we go from here? This is my last slide. So I'm gonna after I'm done with this, I'm gonna open it up for people to discuss and ask. And I'm hoping we have some geologists here even who can even add information from what I know, because as I say, I'm not a geologist. I'm actually a systematist, not a geologist. Anyway, so both scripture and nature, I believe this. The church has taught this too, although I don't know in practice that we've always applied it strictly. Both scripture and nature, and I put science in parentheses because that's the study of nature really, should inform each other. Now, I'm not sure most of us would argue about that. We might argue about the way that we do that, but yeah, I think we all agree that they should inform each other at some level. So there you go. They should inform each other. And I believe we need to be honest about the lack of scientific support for a worldwide flood. Honesty is the best policy. Don't keep on saying that science supports it if you don't have the data. Keep studying it if you want to, great, but let's not oversell what we've found. Creationists have oversold many times over, and if you go back through the history of creationism in the 20th century, there's been a lot of egg on our face when we've oversold certain things. Like finding pollen in lower layers in the Grand Canyon was one example. That happened back in the 50s. And then many people rechecked it, and it was obviously an error. But that was touted for a while. And there are many other stories of that sort. So we need to be careful not to use scientific evidence that doesn't really support a worldwide flood to do so. So I think we need to be honest. Just be honest. Doesn't mean we have to give up on a worldwide flood story. I think we just need to accept that to maintain that belief in a literal interpretation, that it's going to take more of a faith approach. It's just going to have to be, to say, okay, I have faith that the flood story is true, and God miraculously did whatever it took to make that work. Okay, so that's fine. Let that be, but don't say then that you have science to support that. I also then suggest, and I talk to my students about this, and I think it's important that we be able to talk to each other. Allow members of the church to disagree on whether the story is literal or figurative, and allow church theologians to thoroughly investigate ways to reconcile our theology to a possible figurative interpretation of the story. At least investigate it, at least talk about it. Don't just attack anybody who suggests that maybe the story is figurative. That's not really very helpful if we just start attacking each other. And I say that both ways. I don't want to go around attacking people on either side of the spectrum. And that's why I end by saying, be kind to others who have different views on this topic. We need kindness in this. We need to have an ability to set aside our dogmatic ways of thinking. And by the way, the dogmatism goes both ways on this, and be able to talk about it, and then respect each other for the views that we may hold, even though we may not agree. We may not like the views of some others, but I think we owe it to everybody to allow for this open dialogue. So that's where I'm going to stop. And if there are questions or comments or discussion, I'd love to hear it.